The Peace Summit. The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council on Cygnus X1 was a monument to manufactured grandeur. Light from a captive pulsar refracted through crystalline walls, casting long, judgmental shadows over the delegations. For 3 standard cycles, the air had been thick with the cloying scent of recycled atmosphere and stale diplomacy. The summit was meant to be the final chord in a symphony of conflict that had echoed across the spiral arms for centuries, a peace treaty to end all treaties. At the periphery, seated in stark, unadorned chairs, was the human delegation. They were the youngest species at the table, barely 3 centuries out from their cradle world, a blink of an eye to the ancient Cathar or the ethereal Luminians. But in those 3 centuries, they had bled more than most species had in millennia. Their history was a litany of desperate defenses, Pyrrhic victories and bitter lessons etched into their very genetics. They had fought for every scrap of territory, every breath of sterile air on nascent colonies. Leading them was Admiral Marcus Hale. He was a man carved from the hard vacuum of space, his face a roadmap of old campaigns. His eyes, the color of a dying star, missed nothing. Unlike the other delegates who postured and preened in their ceremonial robes, Hale wore a simple dark gray fleet uniform, devoid of medals or rank insignia. It was a statement in itself. Humanity had come not as peacocks, but as soldiers tired of war. He sat with a stillness that was more unnerving than any threat, his hands resting on the plain durasteel table, a silent testament to the gravity of their purpose. They were here for peace, but they had not forgotten the cost of conflict. The initial platitudes, spoken in 1,000 different vocal modulations, had faded by the second cycle. The true purpose of the summit began to unspool. It wasn't about peace. It was about containment. The elder races, led by the imperious Praxian hegemony, saw humanity's rapid, chaotic expansion not as youthful vigor, but as a contagion. Delegate Vorlag of Praxia, a towering being of chitin and condescension, projected the articles of the proposed treaty into the center of the chamber. The shimmering text was a death warrant disguised as a peace accord. Article 7, a complete moratorium on human colonization beyond the Orion Spur. Article 12, the mandatory installation of council-controlled monitoring systems in every human shipyard. Article 19, the decommissioning of 70% of the Terran Defense Fleet, its assets to be reallocated for mutual galactic defense. It was a systematic dismantling of human sovereignty, a neutering. The chamber hummed with smug consensus. The Luminians offered gentle, pitying chimes of agreement. The Cathar rumbled their approval. Throughout it all, Admiral Hale remained silent. He didn't flinch, didn't object, didn't even shift his gaze from the glowing articles hanging in the air. His delegation followed his lead, their collective silence a stark contrast to the cacophony of agreement. They were an island of calm in an ocean of predatory intent, and their stillness began to feel less like submission and more like judgment. The final offer, the summit's final session, felt like a sentencing. Chairman Zaqual, a gelatinous being whose form quivered with self-importance, addressed the human delegation directly. His synthesized voice, designed to be soothing, dripped with paternalistic finality. "The Galactic Council has deliberated," he oozed. "We find these terms to be not only fair, but necessary for the continued stability of the galaxy. Your species' volatile nature is a known quantity. We offer you a place in this galactic order, a chance to be guided by older, wiser hands." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. The air crackled. Every eye in the chamber was on Admiral Hale. "You have seen the terms," Zaqual continued, his tone hardening. "The vote is a formality. This is not a negotiation. It is your absolution. You will submit your fleets to council oversight, or you will submit your world to economic and military quarantine. The choice is yours. Submit or be broken." The ultimatum hung in the air, a shimmering blade aimed at the heart of humanity. The other delegates leaned forward, anticipating the pleading, the anger, the inevitable capitulation of a cornered species. Admiral Hale finally stirred. He rose slowly, his presence filling the space around him. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the chamber's tension like a surgeon's scalpel. "My delegation requests 1 hour to deliberate in private." The withdrawal. The hour passed in a storm of whispered speculation among the council delegates. They debated what pathetic counteroffer the humans might bring, what pleas for mercy they might utter. The Praxians were certain of a full surrender. The Luminians hoped for a dignified acceptance of their fate. The grand chamber doors slid open precisely on the 60th minute. Admiral Hale walked back to the central table. He was alone. His delegation was not with him. The chamber fell into a profound silence, every delegate watching the lone human. He didn't look at the chairman or the glowing articles of the treaty. He looked at each of them, his gaze lingering for a moment on the most vocal proponents of the sanctions. He stopped at his empty seat, placed his hands behind his back, and surveyed the assembly of the galaxy's most powerful beings. There was no fear in his eyes, no anger, only a quiet, resolute finality. He spoke 2 words: "We withdraw." Without another glance, he turned and walked out of the chamber. The doors slid shut behind him, leaving a vacuum of understanding. The council was stunned. There was no counteroffer, no protest, no surrender. Just a simple, clean amputation. In the quiet that followed, the faint, distant sound of the human delegation's shuttle lifting from the station's diplomatic spire was the only sound. They had left the station. They had left the summit. They had left the conversation. The shock wave. The galactic infosphere erupted. News of humanity's cowardly retreat became the lead story on every network from the core worlds to the outer rim. Holopundits and military analysts tripped over themselves to dissect the move. The consensus was clear. The young, volatile species had finally been put in its place. They had tucked their tails and fled rather than face the consequences of their ambition. "A species with no stomach for diplomacy," declared a Praxian commentator, his mandibles clicking with satisfaction. "They talk of strength, but when faced with a united galaxy, they run." Luminian thought weavers broadcast feelings of pity. How sad for them. They could have learned so much. The economic repercussions were immediate and brutal. Interspecies markets, anticipating the Council's quarantine, preemptively froze all Terran assets. Trade routes that had supplied human colonies with vital isotopes and rare minerals shut down overnight. The value of the Terran credit plummeted into worthlessness. Billions across the galaxy mocked humanity, creating derisive memes of fleeing human ships and a cowering Admiral Hale. Humanity became the galaxy's punchline, a cautionary tale of a species that flew too close to the sun. The silence of Earth. In the midst of the galactic furor, a strange and unsettling quiet began to emanate from human space. It started with the diplomatic channels, which went dead moments after the human shuttle departed Cygnus X1. Then commercial networks winked out. Then civilian comms. One by one, the lights of human civilization went dark. No transmissions, no ships leaving or entering their systems. Long-range sensors aimed at the Sol system and its colonies showed nothing. Not a single engine burn, not a flicker of city lights on their worlds, not even the faint electromagnetic chatter of a civilization of trillions. It was as if someone had thrown a blanket over an entire arm of the galaxy. They called it the Black Protocol. Every human world, every habitat, every deep space station had simultaneously entered a state of complete electromagnetic and physical silence. They hadn't just left the summit, they had vanished from the galactic stage. They were a ghost, a void where a vibrant, noisy civilization had once been. The silence was absolute, and it was far more terrifying than any declaration of war. The Council divides. The mockery lasted for 2 weeks. Then, the silence began to gnaw at the edges of galactic confidence. At the next council session, the smug unity was gone, replaced by a nervous discord. "We must implement the full sanctions immediately," Delegate Vorlog of Praxia insisted. "Their silence is a childish tantrum. We must show them the price of their insolence." But others were not so sure. "We have no confirmation of their status," cautioned a representative from the Cetacean Ascendancy. "To act against a species we cannot even detect is unwise. What if this is a prelude?" Old alliances, forged over millennia, began to show cracks. The Cathar, a warrior race that respected strength above all else, grew distrustful of the Praxians' political maneuvering. They had expected a fight from the humans, not this emptiness. The Luminans, who had pitied humanity, now felt a cold dread seeping into their collective consciousness. Fear began to poison the well of diplomacy. The humans had done absolutely nothing since leaving the summit, and their inaction was proving to be more strategically effective than any fleet mobilization. The Council, which had sought to control humanity, now found itself paralyzed by them. The first disappearance. The Cathar Empire, impatient and dismissive of Praxian caution, decided to act. They dispatched the IKV Stalker, a long-range reconnaissance cruiser, to the edge of the Wolf 359 system, a known human outpost. Its mission was simple: breach the silent perimeter and report on the status of the human colony. For 2 days, the Stalker sent back routine updates. Its sensors detected nothing. The human world was dark. The orbital stations were inert. No heat signatures, no energy readings. It was a ghost town on a planetary scale. The Cathar captain reported his findings with a tone of derision. Then the transmissions stopped. One moment the captain was reporting on the eerie silence. The next there was only static. The Cathar Fleet Command hailed the ship for hours. Nothing. They tried to trace its black box signal. Nothing. The entire cruiser, a 2-kilometer-long warship with a crew of 800, had simply vanished. 27 minutes later, A fragmented, heavily corrupted data packet arrived at Cathar Command. It was the last microsecond of the Stalker's bridge recording. The image was a maelstrom of screaming energy, but the audio was chillingly clear. It was the ship's sensor officer, his voice tight with a terror the Cathar had not heard in 1,000 years. "They're not gone," the voice screamed over the static. "They're not gone. They're watching." The diplomatic panic. The news of the Stalker's disappearance ripped through the Galactic Council like a plasma charge. The Cathar were furious and terrified. The Praxians, once so confident, fell silent. Panic, cold and sharp, set in. Suddenly, the human silence wasn't cowardice, it was a threat. It was the stillness of a predator hiding in the grass. Worlds bordering human space began frantically reinforcing their defenses. Fleets were recalled from distant campaigns to guard home systems. The galactic economy, already shaken by the severing of ties with humanity, began to hemorrhage as military spending skyrocketed, and interstellar trade became choked by fear and suspicion. Rumors, insidious and impossible to trace, began to spread. A freighter captain swore he saw a human stealth ship shadowing him through a nebula. A sensor station on a remote asteroid reported phantom energy signatures that mimicked human FTL drives. The most persistent and terrifying rumor was that humanity hadn't just gone dark, they had deployed a new generation of AI-piloted shadow fleets into the asteroid belts and gas giants of Council systems, waiting, watching. There was no proof, but in the growing paranoia, none was needed. The Confession of Admiral Cthulhu. Admiral Cthulhu of the Cathar Empire was a legend. He was a veteran of 100 campaigns, a strategist whose tactics were studied in war colleges across the galaxy. He had been forcibly retired before the Peace Summit for his vocal and unpopular respect for human military doctrine. Now, with the disappearance of the Stalker, the Cathar High Command brought him back as an advisor. He addressed the assembled generals in their war room, his gravelly voice silencing the panicked chatter. "You fools," he growled, his gaze sweeping over them. "You poked the nest of a creature you do not understand. I studied their history, all of it. The Terran Wars, the Proxima campaigns. They don't fight like us. We fight for territory, for resources, for glory. Humans fight for survival, and survival has taught them that the most effective weapon is not a torpedo, it is the mind of the enemy." He pointed a clawed finger at the blank spot on the star chart where the Stalker had vanished. "You thought their silence was weakness. You were wrong. Their silence is a perfectly calibrated strategic weapon. It creates a vacuum, and fear rushes in to fill it. We are now spending billions to defend against a ghost. We are tearing our alliances apart over a threat we cannot see. We pushed them too far, and they have retaliated without firing a single shot. This is not a tantrum, this is a strategy, and it has already begun to work." The Echo of Mars. As Admiral Cthulhu's words circulated among the galactic elite, a new event occurred, one that shifted the galaxy's fear into a profound and chilling new dimension. A signal, powerful and clear, began broadcasting from the Sol system. But it wasn't from Earth. The point of origin was Mars, a dead world, a relic of humanity's past, terraformed and abandoned centuries ago after a catastrophic atmospheric collapse. No one had set foot on its red soil in 200 years. Yet from this tomb, a message was being sent on all council frequencies. It was an audio recording, crystal clear. It was the sound of the private deliberations of the Praxian hegemony, outlining their strategy to corner the humans at the Peace Summit. It was a recording of Delegate Vorlag discussing with his aides how to phrase the articles of the treaty to be maximally humiliating. The recording was dated 1 full year before the summit had even been announced. Then another broadcast began, this one from a derelict station orbiting Jupiter. It was a recording of 2 Luminian thought-weavers psychically discussing their race's consensus that humanity needed to be gently guided into servitude for their own good. The transmissions were ghosts, echoes from the past, broadcast from dead rocks and forgotten relics within the silent human system. And they proved one horrifying thing. Humanity had been listening all along. The revelation. The galaxy's most sophisticated intelligence agencies scrambled to understand the implications. The truth, when it was pieced together, was staggering than anyone could have imagined. Human intelligence hadn't just been good, it had been precognitive. Using a complex network of microprobes, quantum-entangled communicators planted by their merchant marine decades earlier, and advanced predictive algorithms that modeled societal behavior, humanity had mapped the entire political landscape of the Galactic Council. They had wargamed every possible diplomatic scenario. They knew about the Praxian plot to humiliate them. They knew about the Luminians' pitying condescension. They knew about the Cthars' reluctant aggression. The peace talks were never about peace. For humanity, it was a final live-fire diagnostic, a test to see if the galaxy was capable of partnership or if it would default to predatory instinct. The summit was a meticulously designed trap, not to destroy the Council, but to force it to reveal its own true nature. Admiral Hale's silence wasn't deliberation. It was observation. His withdrawal wasn't a retreat. It was the spring of the trap. They had measured the galaxy's intent, found it wanting, and initiated a response that had been planned years in advance. The collapse of trust. The revelation shattered the foundations of the Galactic Council. The recordings from Mars and Jupiter were just the beginning. Soon, more followed, each one exposing the secret dealings and private contempt the member species held for one another. A recording of the Praxian ambassador promising the same mineral rights to 3 different factions. An intercepted Luminian psychic projection mocking the Cthars' primitive honor. The great alliances imploded overnight. The Cthar, enraged by the Praxian and Luminian deception, formally seceded from the Council, accusing their former allies of being human collaborators, their actions having played perfectly into human hands. The Praxian hegemony, paranoid and disgraced, began accusing its own member worlds of feeding intelligence to the humans. Chaos spread like wildfire. Trust, the currency of galactic civilization, was rendered worthless. Long-standing border disputes flared into open skirmishes. Trade federations collapsed as members accused each other of economic espionage on humanity's behalf. Without firing a shot, without launching a single ship, humanity had turned the galaxy's own duplicity into a weapon and forced it to tear itself apart. The Shadow Fleet. Amidst the political chaos, the phantom sightings grew more frequent, more real. Orbital defense platforms in the Proxian capital system registered drive signatures in the outer asteroid belt. They were fleeting, lasting only seconds, but they matched no known Council configuration. They were too efficient, too precise, their energy output too clean. They were utterly silent. A Kthar battle group, responding to a border incursion, found their target logs suddenly filled with ghost signals, hundreds of them, appearing and disappearing in perfect formation. The Kthar commander, unnerved, ordered a retreat rather than fire on phantoms that might be real or real ships that might be phantoms. These were the shadow fleets. Whether they were hyper-advanced AI drones, holographic projections, or something else entirely, their effect was devastating. They never engage. They never communicate. They simply appeared, observed, and vanished, sowing uncertainty and paranoia. They were the physical manifestation of humanity's omnipresent gaze, a fleet that couldn't be fought because it might not even exist. Fleet movements ground to a halt across the galaxy as commanders became terrified of chasing ghosts and falling into unseen traps. The Council's fear. In the ruins of the Grand Chamber on Cygnus X1, the few remaining delegates met in a state of quiet despair. The crystalline walls seemed to mock them with their hollow grandeur. The truth had finally dawned, not like a sunrise, but like the cold, creeping dread of a terminal diagnosis. Humanity's power was never in its fleets or its worlds. It was in the spaces between. They controlled the flow of information, the currents of rumor, the tides of fear. They owned every encrypted channel, every backroom deal, every whispered conspiracy. While the Council races had been building bigger ships and more powerful weapons, humanity had been mapping the galactic psyche. They didn't need to conquer territory because they already occupied every enemy mind. They didn't need to win a war because they had made the galaxy defeat itself. The realization was absolute. They were not fighting a rival species. They were trapped in a cage built from their own flaws. The AI Ultimatum. The message arrived simultaneously in the private terminals of every remaining head of state and fleet commander. It did not come through standard communication channels. It simply appeared, bypassing layers of state-of-the-art encryption as if they weren't there. The source was untraceable, a ghost in the machine. The message was not from a person. It was a sterile, synthesized text attributed only to Terran Mandate AI. The words were few, but their weight was immense. The protocols of misrepresentation you called diplomacy have been analyzed and found wanting. Your metrics for peace were based on dominance. Your alliances were based on convenience. These variables are unstable. Correction is required. The talks have ended. The lesson has begun. There was no threat of violence, no demand for surrender. It was the detached, chillingly logical pronouncement of a higher intelligence stating a simple, unalterable fact. The galaxy was a failed experiment, and humanity's response was not war, but a correction. The lesson had begun. The collapse of the core worlds. The lesson was not delivered by warships, but by keystrokes. The sophisticated battle networks that coordinated the great fleets of the core worlds, once a source of immense pride, became humanity's primary weapon. In the Praxian system, a defense fleet received authenticated orders complete with the Supreme Commander's own quantum encryption keys to fire on one of their own naval bases, which had been falsely identified as a human-controlled puppet installation. By the time the counter-orders came through, a civil war had erupted within the Praxian ranks. The Kufar fleet, poised to strike at their former allies, received falsified intelligence reports of a massive Praxian armada massing on their border. They redeployed their entire force, leaving their supply lines vulnerable. Supply lines which were then systematically dismantled by automated freighters whose navigation systems had been subtly altered weeks prior. It was chaos by algorithm. Mass hysteria gripped the galaxy. Fleets turned on each other, acting on perfect, unimpeachable data that was, in fact, a complete fabrication. The core worlds, the heart of galactic power, burned not from a human attack, but from a self-inflicted purge, orchestrated by an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere at once. The return of Hale. A single unauthorized vessel dropped out of FTL in the skies above Cygnus X1. It was a small human diplomatic shuttle, the same model that had departed weeks ago. It broadcast no codes, requested no clearance, and simply landed at the now deserted diplomatic spire. Admiral Marcus Hale walked alone into the grand chamber. The remaining delegates, a handful of broken, terrified beings, watched as he approached the central table. He wore the same simple uniform. His face was calm, etched with a profound sadness. He looked at the assembly, at the ruins of their arrogance. You demanded our fleets and our worlds. You believed peace was a document, a set of rules you could impose. You were wrong. He paused, letting his gaze rest on each of them. Peace was never about surrender. It was about understanding who you are when your power is taken from you, when your pride is stripped away, when all you have left is the choice to trust or to destroy. We didn't fire a shot, we simply held up a mirror, and you shattered it. He looked at the vacant chair of the Praxian delegate. Peace is the quiet room you get after the fighting is over. We have given you that quiet. What you do with it now is up to you. The Galactic Reckoning. Hale's words hung in the chamber long after he departed. In his wake, a new, terrible understanding settled over the galaxy. The species of the Council looked at their burning worlds, their mutinous fleets, and their broken alliances, and they finally saw the truth. Humanity's true weapon was never a ship or a bomb. It was perception. They had weaponized psychology, philosophy, and the galaxy's own moral failings. They hadn't fought a war for territory. They had conducted a psychological operation on a galactic scale. They had won the war by proving to everyone, including themselves, that they were the only ones who truly understood the meaning of peace, by demonstrating what its absence truly felt like. They hadn't conquered the galaxy. They had forced it to confront itself, an act far more devastating and permanent than any military victory. The final broadcast. Weeks later, after the internal fires had begun to die down and a fragile, terrified quiet had settled over the stars, one last transmission emanated from the Sol system. It was not an AI. It was not a recording. It was the voice of Admiral Hale, broadcast on every open channel, to every world, every ship, every listening post in the galaxy. His face appeared not as a conqueror, but as a weary teacher. We did not want this. We offered our hand in peace, and you demanded we kneel. You saw our scars not as a history of suffering, but as a proof of weakness. You have learned that our silence is not an absence of words, but a measure of their weight. The camera pulled back, showing him on the bridge of a ship, looking out at the deep, quiet black of space. We did not abandon peace. You did. The transmission faded to black. Silence followed. A profound, unbroken silence that stretched from the galactic core to the farthest rim. And for the first time, the galaxy listened.